So we are up to Os Pei Pshuta, in the Osios Mansepach. So to give a recap of the Os Pei in its regular form, Os Pei, we spoke about how the Os Pei embodies the idea of the multiple forces that are coalescing within the inner consciousness of a person and are yearning to burst out, so to speak, in the form of articulated speech, and how this is it's almost miraculous that things of that of this magnitude could be communicated with compartmentalized words. Very often they're not. Very often it doesn't work. Very often words are just, in the best case scenario, they're empty, and in the worst case, they're malicious or just more confusing. But it's a miracle that things at the level of complexity and the level of loftiness that are contained in the inner human experience can be expressed in articulated speech, in compartmentalized speech. We brought the example how this manifests itself even in halacha. We read from the Rambam in the end of Hilchos Sanhedrin that there is this is sourced in the fourth parak of the Yerushalmi in Maseches Sanhedrin, that there is a din of called Ptach Picha Le'ileim, that the Dayan is given. It's not just the authority, but it's his obligation to open the mouth of the mute. And when we say that to open the mouth of the mute, which is a pasuk from Mishlei, open the mouth of the mute, doesn't mean someone who's physically or literally mute, but it means someone who is struggling to be able to articulate themselves and can't do it. Whereas the Rambam famously says, because he's so flustered by the experience of being in the courtroom with the litigant guy claiming against him and the judge is sitting there, he's very intimidated by the situation, he can't get out what he's trying to get out. So the Dayan is meant to help this guy speak out what he's already trying to say, or too confused that he's not able to say it in a clear fashion. So this is the idea of the Os Pei. It's a type of settling of self, of backing up, like the vision that I had, or the visual rather. There's no visions, not yet, but the visual that I had was almost like a dam, right? Like a massive wall holding back this huge amount of water, and trickling out in a measured fashion is the water, just to keep the pressure from becoming overwhelmed. So similarly, the inner experience of the human being is this massive oceanic. We've even seen specific times where the symbolism of the ocean comes up in Os Mem and in Os Nun. This idea of this oceanic force that's trying to burst forth, and there are tools that can express that in a compartmentalized fashion. So there's this calming effect. There's this, right, as Rav Kook said, peh, the Os Pei, it has the connotation of peh, mouth, meaning the tools of speech, and it also has the connotation of po, here, ad po, meaning giving a boundary to a thing. So by the self-retreat, so to speak, that gives the person a little bit of self-awareness and self-perspective, they're able to calmly and with a little bit of self-discipline give expression to lofty, high things in a compartmentalized way, and to not get to that point where they become the ilmim, they become the mute. I'm just thinking of this. This is just coming to my mind. There's an idea in Hebrew idiom. The Chazal tell us in Medrash Rabbah that the idioms of the Hebrew speakers require study. Right? Gam sichas chulin shel bnei Eretz Yisrael tzrichim Talmud. That's a Midrash Rabbah. The idioms, the mundane speech of the people who live in the land of Israel, they require study. So one of the whole conversation in itself. But one such idiom that we find throughout Chazal is that there's a term to express a blind person called Sagi Nahor, which literally means he's very immense in vision. Sagi means a lot. He has a lot of vision. Sagi Nahor, which is alluding to a very deep idea that the faculties sometimes do not function because they're in overload. And today in computer science, anyone who has any connection to cybersecurity or anything to that, right, there's this idea of the distributed denial of service attack. Have you heard of this idea? The distributed denial of service. What? DDoS. Right. DDoS, the DDoS attack. So what is that? It's when you send an overwhelming amount of signals to a website, the regular signals, people trying to get access to this or open this page or do that, right? But it's so overwhelming that the page stops functioning. It's a fascinating thing. So we experience that also. When there's so much stimulation, it's stimulus overload, so the thing doesn't work. So it's sagin ahor, it's blindness due to an overwhelming amount of light. And similarly, it's a mute. It's mute not because they can't open their mouth, not because there's nothing to say. No, there's so much to say. It overwhelms the faculties of speech. So the idea of the pei is adpo. There's a disciplining and tzimtzum, a constraining, constricting effect that allows the articulation to take place, because otherwise it would just be too overwhelming. So that is the os pei in its regular form, the pei kfufa, the regular pei that appears in the beginning and in the middle of a word. So what is the pei pshuta? The pei pshuta is exactly that, the simple pei. The simple pei, whereas the pei kfufa energy is a very constricting and intense, disciplining energy. It's like that. It's like the huge Hoover Dam that's holding back the massive floodgates, right? Well, excuse me, it is the floodgates, and it's keeping the massive water held back, and it's letting it out in very compartmentalized, constricted ways. So it's this very disciplined energy. The pei pshuta is a more gentle energy. It's when the tools of speech, they're able to maintain discipline, they're able to maintain their compartmentalized structures, but there's more of a flow, there's more ease to it, right? It's like the difference between, let's say, for example, the difference between giving instructions verbally in a very rigid way and singing an ode or singing a poem, something like that. The words, they flow. They can describe the same thing. They perhaps even describe it even better, with better efficiency. But there's a flow there, so it doesn't lose the compartmentalized function of the words. We need words to be very compartmentalized and fixed in order to express, but at the same time, it's pashut, it's simple, it flows. So to read what Rav Kook says, and again, these OTO tend to be very, very short, with the exception of Os Tzadi, which is extremely long, but we'll get there in a moment. So Os Pei Pshuta, HaKoach HaMiluli, the power of articulation, B'shiluv HaTochen HaMagbil Et HaKoach, which is the power of constricting or giving boundaries, as we explained. The Os Pei is the idea of being able to give boundaries to the outflow where it doesn't become overwhelming. That's the Koach HaMiluli. Hashpa'a v'ha'etaniut, Oz HaChayim, the power of life, V'hod Tokvam, and their glorious strength, Mimala Otzah Mituar B'tziltzilei HaMevatim, which is above the rings, which literally mean rings, but it means like the sounds of articulation. It stands above, like that Oz HaChayim, that power of life. It stands above the tools of articulation, and it's waiting to be expressed. Again, that imagery of like the water behind the gates that's rushing it's rushing out. It wants to burst forth, and so the tools of articulation need to give it, some type of measured expression. And Hadibor Mefurash Mitmaleh Migayon V'Seichel. They're looking to be expressed in the explicit dibur, in the explicit speech, which can then be filled with logic and intellect and insight. Migvanei Chayim Ba'orot Ritzonim, the full spectrum of life and all of the lights of all the wills contained in the person. Harei Choderhu El Tocho Hahod Ha'elyon Shel Ha'Hitztairut Hamilulit. So it can Choder can penetrate in this divine splendor, this lofty splendor of the formulation of words, the formulation of articulation. So again, all of this is kind of a recap on Os Pei, which is that there is a power of articulation. The Hitztairut HaMilulit, the formulation of words that can interact with this oceanic, overwhelming Oz HaChayim, the power of life, and it can give it articulation. He's Ramamut HaYigayon HaPnimi B'Yesod HaDibor, Koach HaPeh B'Pshituto. Then we come to the power of the mouth in its expanded or simplistic form, which is Od Pei Pshuta. Oz HaGvul HaOmer Ad Po Tavo, which says until here you can come, meaning it's the power of constraint which is contained within the pei, because it has to have power of constraint, otherwise it will be overwhelmed, like we explained. Mitzad Erko Abelti Gvuli Sheshamu Chavyon Peiro B'Ta'atzumo, contained within it, hidden within it, is this tremendous splendor and strength. Kol Negohim Halalu Midgalim Beziv Pei Pshuta Ba'otzem Chela. All of these are revealed in the light of the simple pei, with the strength of its valor, with the strength of its valor. So again, the Ot Pei, and as we've said again, and we'll and we should repeat it for every letter. The idea of the Otiot Mansepach is that there are certain letters, these particular 5 letters, they have their regular manifestation and then they have their redeemed and elevated manifestation. So whereas the Os Pei is this necessary, strong constraint that gives a very measured expression to this overwhelming life force, i.e. articulated words to express the overwhelming inner experience. It's this very constricted energy. The pei pshuta, the simple pei or the final pei, it's able to perform that same function of measured articulation, but not in this very rigid fashion. It's able to just flow and be simple. Pshuta, it's spread out. So that comes with practice of being able. Right, first comes the pei kfufa of being silent. We've spoken about the necessity of being silent. A very well-known statement. It comes up a few times in Maseches Avos about the relationship between silence and wisdom, gvul l'chachma, right, or siag l'chachma, shtika. That the fence for wisdom is silence, the ability to be silent. So there's this overwhelming force that needs to be found. It needs to be given a place of expression. The first step is silence. The first step is inner contemplation. And then after enough inner contemplation has taken place, you have maybe a hope of articulating it into words with precision that are somewhat accurate in expressing the thing. After you've had enough practice with that, after a few years of practicing that, this very, very precise articulation, then the os pshuta, or the pei pshuta rather, can express itself, where the words, they just flow. There's no more constriction, there's no more rigidness, they just flow in the pashut form. Okay, we're good on os pei pshuta? Yeah? Bakasha.
Every man is the dayan in his house, but he's also the defendant, right? So who's the prosecutor? It's the Isha, right? Because the Midrash Rabbah said the Nachash was for Chava, but Chava was the Nachash for Adam. In the sense,
that's the kenegdo. It's a litigant, right? It's a litigant.
Yeah, she should be against us to help us. But if our wife is having trouble articulating her grievances against us, we have to determine, is this a Nachash that wants to be a Mateh, or it's a Nachash that wants to stay a Nachash?
It's a very interesting perspective. You're saying even in the litigation, so to speak, that we experience every day in more mundane circumstances, not necessarily in Beit Din.
That's only what it's about. That's what the whole Torah is about. We're not in Beit Din every day. The Beit Din is my house.
Right. The Maharal,
the Dayan. My wife is the litigant. There's this
for sure.
Constant judgments are happening.
The Maharal says in the first parak of Maseches Avos in Derech Chaim, he says that all of the things that are said in Maseches Avos and in Chazal in general about what takes place in Beit Din, about how one should conduct themselves in Beit Din, are also advice about how one should conduct themselves in their own mind, because there's always a court case going on in one's own mind. Nachon. Okay, so Os Tzadi. Os Tzadi is its own Os, obviously, has its own specific message, but as we're going to see, Os Tzadi is really a very, very nice sliding into home of the whole theme of Mansepach. We'll share some what I think are some very, very beautiful ideas. Going back to our original conversation on Otiot Mansepach and their symbolism and what they mean in the origin stories that Chazal give on Otiot Mansepach. So, well, just to give an introduction, the idea that is going to be delivered over here is the idea of idealism, and then how idealism is put into action, and the crushing disappointment that is an inevitability of trying to put idealism into the world, and then how that is rectified, how the disappointment and the frustration is rectified in the end. That is the whole theme of Otiot Mansepach, according to Rav Kook. Idealism in the beginning, the attempt to put it into practice, and the crushing disappointment that will inevitably take place, and how it comes full circle to be rectified. That's the true geula, right? That's the geula element. Again, the whole thing.
Of the broken idealism.
The rectification of the disappointment that comes with trying to act out idealism. Yes. So first he speaks out a theme unique to Os Tzadi, and again, like we did with Ot Pei, just to give a brief recap of the regular Ot Tzadi. We talked about how Ot Tzadi is the theme. It's a theme that's very, very powerfully correlated with the sphera called in the Kabbalistic jargon the sphera of Yesod. Yesod is the energy of being able to collect disparate things together in order to be able to be a provider or a mashpia, an influential or providing force. The Otiot Yesod is a very powerful masculine energy of gathering all the resources together in order to be able to be a giver. We quoted the pasuk, read the pasuk in Mishlei. Ta'avat Tzadik Tevoenu. There's actually two verses in Mishlei that the desires of the righteous, they come to him, and immediately following is another also very well-known verse. Ba'avor Sufa the Ein Rasha. After the storm wind comes, the Rasha is gone because he's been swept away. The Tzadik Yesod Olam. But the righteous is the foundations of all the earth, which is why, incidentally, why that word was chosen in the Kabbalistic tradition to describe this attribute. It's not like it's written anywhere in the Torah. This is the name for this attribute. On the contrary, there's many names for the attribute, but this is a very very common term for this attribute because how this is associated with the tzaddik in this context. What does that mean? The Rasha, he's so unstable and he has no foundations that when the storm wind comes, he's blown away. He's completely blown away. The tzaddik, he's so strong. Not only is he not blown away, but he's the foundations of everyone else. That's the contrast of the tzaddik to the Rasha. So the idea of the yesod of the tzadi, so Rav Kook opens up with how tzadi is lashon stadim, to become smichut, to come close, to bring disparate things together in the context of creating a harmony that's functional. Harmony that's functional in order to be able to be a mashpia, in order to be able to be a giver. Tzaddik also has the connotation of justice. Justice means giving people their just due. That's what it means, mishpat. As we've talked about in other contexts, the word mishpat today in modern Hebrew has a more narrow connotation. Mishpat, like either the law or the conclusion of a court case. It's a law. It's like a legal conclusion. But mishpat also has the connotation of giving people their just due, like in a positive sense, like we say in Kabbalat Shabbat, right? That the world is going to be so happy, right? Lishpota ta'aretz. Why is everyone so happy that God's coming to judge the earth? Doesn't seem like such a nice thing, but the idea is that lishpot haaretz means to come give the world what it needs. That's what it means, right? Like Shlomo HaMelech, he prays at the inauguration of the first temple. He says that these words, these words that I prayed before you, krovim el Hashem Elokecha ma'od, they should be very close to you. La'asot mishpat avdecha, to the mishpat of your servant, meaning Shlomo, mishpat amo Yisrael dvar yom b'yomo, and the mishpat of the Jewish people every day. Meaning it's to give the just need, to give the people what they need. Right, so that's the mishpat associated with the tzedek. So the tzadi is the tzadim, bringing all the resources together in order to bring tzedek, in order to bring justice, which is the just need of everyone. So that's the idea of tzaddik in it, right? It's in its more general and generic form. And now, what is the tzadi pshuta? What is the simple tzadi? So hatzadim chitzonim b'magam, the external, let's say more superficial sides of reality when they come together, when they make contact with each other. Yesod hatzedek haklali. This is the foundations of tzedek, of justice in its generality. And that's just a poetic way of saying when does tzedek become relevant? When different people begin to have interactions. If you have a guy living by himself in the middle of the woods, justice is not a relevant thing. Who is he arguing with? Like where is there a machlokas? Where is there any room for strife? Strife. What? Well, what?
You're obviously not in my.
So, right. So, yes. Again, all this can be played out at the internal level, at the level of the individual. But tzedek in its typical form is working out harmony between individuals. So, but hatzadim achitzonim b'magam, it means that right when things bump into each other, when things crash into each other, now tzedek becomes relevant. Which has to do with the fact that it is right next to the tochen hakofi, the kof-like energy that came before it. Right? We talked about the ot kuf and how the kuf is the idea of copying or mimicking, which is the ot that comes right after it. Harehu sho'ev et mayanav me'oto ha'erech shel hatzedek harachav. It draws its strength from that value of the general or more wide tzedek. Now that is so. That's saying tzedek in its applied form in the real world of bringing justice to like a real world scenario. That is meant to draw itself from this ideal of righteousness. Shalat tzedek harachav, the wide or sublime form of justice. Habilti mutneit b'tnaim mugbalim, which is not dependent on any external circumstances. Tivim, natural, hegyonim, logical. V'hatztadim atzmam b'magam b'yosher tzidkam klapei ha'olam. When these tzadim, when these sides, meaning the external aspects of things, when they crash into each other, b'magam b'yosher tzidkam klapei ha'olam, when they are facing the rest of reality, hachitzonim, the external, asher yisuvam, that surround them, meaning when any individual thing comes in contact or crashes in to all the other individuals that are surrounding it. Harehem yomkim miyesod hatzedek hamitgaleh b'koach elyon hachavoi shel hatzadik habilti mutneit. So they come to the ability to draw down an inspiration of justice from a place that is not dependent on external circumstances. So again, to speak this out in perhaps a more straightforward language, there is tzedek in the practical, everyday sense, where you have arguments with people. I remember hearing this one of the first comments that I heard as a child when first discovering the concept of Beit Din. He said, Beit Din is probably one of the most uncomfortable places that anyone can be in, because who comes to Beit Din? Who comes to Beit Din? Torah observant Jews. That's why you go to Beit Din, right? People come to Beit Din because they right, both of the sides, they feel that the Torah is an important thing, so they want to come and get a Torah perspective on whatever's going on. And yet, the argument between these people can sometimes be very bitter, can be very serious. Yeah. So you see these arguments between people over huge sums of money, and this guy cheated that guy, and this guy lied to that guy. Right? It becomes very uncomfortable. So tzedek can look very, very ugly. Right? It's the Rav Kook says over here, the chitzoniyut, right? The external sides of us crash into the external sides of everyone else. So it can look very unpleasant. However, the ideal is to draw down inspiration from the tzedek, which is not mutneit. It has nothing to do with any particular external circumstances. It's the pure ideal of justice. This justice is pure harmony that isn't dependent on fixing this or forcing that or forcing this person to do something. It's pure. It's the pure ideal of justice. The pure ideal of justice needs to inspire the application of justice in any given circumstance. So this forms a tatochen ha'ideali, the ideal content, shel kol hayakum, of the entire creation, terem havrooto. Says Rav Kook, this very theme of drawing down inspiration from the ideal to apply in a non-ideal circumstance is the very idea of God creating the world with certain hopes and dreams and aspirations. God also had hopes and dreams and aspirations for the world. And then he set the world into motion, and things didn't exactly go according to plan, to put it lightly. The world didn't exactly look like God wanted to look, to the point that in the very end of Parshas Bereshis, the very first parsha in the Torah, God says, Nichamti ki asiti, I regret what I did. So God had this incredibly lofty ideal, as the Rambam says in Or Nevuchim, at the end, right, the description of Shabbat. God created the world in 6 days. What does that word mean by yinofash? The word nefesh in Lashon HaKodesh means will, right? Like in Yeshus nafshechem, if it will be your will, as Adam Avinu says to the Neches. So it means that that God had a will. He had this dream of creating the world. In 6 days, he fulfilled the dream. Yes, look at this beautiful world that I created. And then he put it into motion, and things should go off the rails, like after the first hour, like not even 50 years down the line. The first hour that man is on the scene, things go off the rails. So this is right. This is the horrible disappointment. However, this idea, this very idea of the ideal going off the rails, and then we needing to come back, is the very foundation, is the very idea of the creation of the world. Umegaleh dinav hakdoshim. And it reveals its holy judgments. B'chol maleh shetach ha'itbarut kula b'chol agafea, and it reveals its holiness in the entire arena, so to speak, of the creation and in all of its outpourings. Or hayesharim umetek hanoam hapnimi, the straight light and the sweetness of the internal pleasantness. Hanoam hapnimi mitchasein b'makor neviato, is still hidden within the source of its outpouring. What does that mean? It means that this ideal of Hashem that God had in the beginning of creation, it's not lost. despite the things went off the rails, which they did go off the rails and became corrupted in their external manifestation, that ideal is still there. Mitchabeh, mitchasein, it's still being stored in its source. Umayanot hayishua mitgabrim, and those sources, those mayanot, are getting strengthened all the time. They want to burst forth. Umi malay yimtzu, and they're just looking for someone to find them. V'shotfim ba'ovrim b'mala kol ha'olam naharei nachalei dvash v'chema. And those mayanot, they're not regular mayanot of water. You think we're talking about mayanot of water? No, these are mayanot of butter and honey. Sounds great. Ashrei ha'am shekachalo. How fortunate is the nation that this is to it. Ashrei ha'am she'ashem elokav. Baruch omer ve'oseh baruch hu. What is that referring to? Baruch omer ve'oseh. We say in Baruch she'omar, blessed is the one who said and did. What is that referring to? He said, God said. Where was the ma'amar? The ma'amar was in the beginning of creation. Right, the ma'amarot. Vayomer Hashem yiyur, all the ma'amarot, the utterances of creation. Blessed is the one who spoke the world into being and did what he said he was going to do. One could say, well, wait a minute. He said what he was going to do, but then things didn't work out that way at all. Like God had this idealistic vision and things did not take that course. But that's the very point. The very point is that we're looking at that potentiality that was created in the very, very beginnings of creation. And despite the fact that things became corrupted, that potentiality still exists and it's constantly coming into being. That flow, the flow of the Mayanot, right, of the original well springs of creation is still there, and it's flowing. The talalei hayaldut. Listen to this. This is beautiful. Talalei hayaldut, the beauty of the dew of childhood. Shehim shavim liitgalot, that they return to reveal themselves. Beresisayim anutzetzim le'et zikna. They begin to bloom at the time of zikna, at the time of elderly age. Bifrat ubechlal, and they bloom in every level, at the level of the individual, the level of the collective, be'ishu ba'oma, of the person and the nation, ba'olam, in the world, uba'olamim, and the spiritual dimensions, b'chol merchavei hayesh, in all of the arenas of existence, b'gviyot u'v'neshamot, in the bodies and souls, hemechaplim revavot monim et ha'osher hagadol shel otzar hachayim, and they exponentialize, mechaplim, they double themselves, right? They exponentialize themselves in the full richness of the storehouses of life. Again, those storehouses of life, those original ideals that God created at the very beginning of creation, and despite the fact that things are not looking the way that they're supposed to, that original potentiality still exists and it's pouring out. Hatchiyah v'hadeah, the revivifying and the knowledge, the consciousness. V'ha'otiyot, and the letters, mitmalot b'miloi orim gedolim, they fill themselves with tremendous light. V'otu dardeke, and the youth come, the Beit Midrasha, to the study house, v'amri, mile da'afilu b'imei Yoshua ben Nun lo itmar kavatayu, and they say insights in Torah that even at the time of Yoshua ben Nun, they were not said. What is that a quote from? That is a quote from the Gemara in Shabbat and Daf Kuf Daled, which we've quoted a few times. We'll get to that in just 1 minute. Haben yaker li Ephraim. That's the pasuk from the Ephraim, right? Ephraim is a precious child to me. Yeled shashuim. It's like the small child that you just love to play with. It's just so joyful to play with this young child. That's how God relates to Ephraim, the corrupt, idolatrous nation that was they were right. You couldn't swing a dead cat without hitting an idol in Ephraim. Ephraim is the northern kingdom. Huh? Nachon. Ki midei dabri bo zachorez karenu. The more I speak about him, the more I want to remember him for good. That's what it says in the pasuk. Al kain hamu me'ai lo. God says this about it, right? My innards, my kishkas, my innards are yearning for him. Rachem arachamenu neum Hashem. I will surely have mercy on him. What are these references talking about? What is this idea about the kids, right? The taleh yaldut, the dew, the light of childhood. It experiences a tchiyah, a revivification at the time of zikna, at the time of elderly age. So first, to give a brief recap on a source that we've already quoted a few times, the Yerushalmi in Maseches Megillah, that gives an interesting version of the origin of Otiot Mansepach. We saw that there's a very old source, an old rabbinic source, that Otiot Mansepach, Sofim Tiknum, the seers, the visionaries, they're the ones that establish them, and there are different understandings of what that means. The Yerushalmi gives its own version, and it says that the visionaries were none other than Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Eliezer when they were small children. Right? We'll just read this. We'll just read the opening lines very quickly because we've done this a few times. Maninun Sofim, who are these Sofim that established the Otziot Mansepach? Maasa Biyom Sagrir was a cold day, that the teachers didn't come to school that day because it was too cold. V'nichnesu atinokos, the small children came. They came to school and there was no one to teach them. So they said, Navid Beivada, so let's do our own lesson, Delo Yivatel. So we won't just sit here and do nothing. And they established these insights into Otiot Mansepach. What is the significance that there's two versions of the Ot Mem, there's two versions of the Ot Nun? That's the origin story of these Sofim, these visionaries. It was the child, this child, right? These two children, they were able to express these incredible insights. What's the Dar Decay? The Dar Decay that Rav Kook quoted, the other source in the Bavli that deals with the letters. Again, we've quoted the source a few times because it literally gives a list of all the letters and their spiritual significance. The Dar Decay. Omri Le Rabbanan Rabbi Shammai ben Levi. Right, the scholars came to Rabbi Shammai ben Levi. Rabbi Shammai ben Levi was a sage in the generation between the Mishnah and the Talmud. Right, they came to Rabbi Shammai ben Levi and they said, Asu dardeke ha'itna. There are a bunch of small children that came lebei midrasha to the study house. Va'amru mile, and they said words dafilu b'mei Yoshua ben Nun lo itmar, that we haven't heard such Torah insights since the time of Yoshua ben Nun. Aleph Beis, Aleph Bina. Why does it say Aleph Beis? Because it's teaching you Aleph Bina, teach or inculcate Bina, understanding. Gimel Dalid, Gamol Dalim. You should do Gemilas Chasadim to the people that are poor, etc. They go on and on and on, giving these incredible drushas on every single letter. It's the children, for some reason, it's the children that are coming and giving these incredible drushot on the letters. I came across this morning. This is 5 hours ago. I happened to be learning this in Turkey in Avos Rabbi Nassan. Avos Rabbi Nassan is a Breita, which is a slightly longer version of Maseches Avos. It gives the very well-known origin story of Rabbi Akiva, the origin story in terms of how he came to study Torah. And it says the following: How did Rabbi Akiva come to study Torah? Ben Arbaim Shana Haya Velo Shana Klum. He was 40 years old and he had not learned anything. Pamachas Hayomid Al Piyad Be'er, right? Again, the well-known story. He's walking along the way. He sees a rock, and the rock has this dripping water above it, and he sees that the water had borne through the rock. So he says, "Miad Rabbi Akiva dan kal v'chomer ba'atzmo." Ma rach pasal sakasha divrei Torah shakasha kabarzel. The words of Torah, they're not like water, right? They're very hard. They're very inspiring. Alachas kama v'kama shiachaku et libi shu basar v'dam. So for sure, the words of Torah can come into my heart. If these drips of water can come into the stone, so words of Torah can come into my heart. Miad chazar lilmud Torah. So he immediately went to study Torah. Halachu ubeno. Rabbi Akiva and his son. The Yashvu Eitzel Malamde Tinokos, and they went to the place where small children learn Torah. You can imagine a 40-year-old man. He takes his son to school, and he stays there. And he sits on the lesson with his little son. Right? Yeah. Amar Le Rabbi Lamdeni Torah. Rabbi Akiva comes up to the teacher. He comes up to the ganenet, and he says, "Listen, teach me. I don't know anything." Right? Achaz Rabbi Akiva Berosh Haluach. So Rabbi Akiva, they handed out luchot, they handed out tablets with all the letters on them, right? V'achaz hu ubeno beluach achas. Him and his son were sitting there with the same luach, with the same tablet of the letters. Hayalomed v'holech. Excuse me, I skipped the line. Right? Hayalomed v'holech. Right? As he sat and learned, hayashoel, he would ask, Lama nichtav aleph zu. Why was this aleph written? Lama nichtav beis zu. Why was this beis written? That's the questions that he was asking himself. Liyamim Allah v'yashav lifnei Rabbi Eliezer v'Rabbi Yoshua. He became older and more advanced in his studies, and he went to Yerushalayim to study by who? Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. Does that ring a bell? Who those characters were? Those were the Tinokot that back in the day they made the first drasha on the otiot, on the letters. Now they're masters. They're the masters of the generation. Rabbi Akiva comes to learn by them, and he says, "Masters, teach me." Mishnah, and they would teach him the Mishnayot. Obviously, not the text of the Mishnah. The text of the Mishnah wasn't written for 2 generations later, but they were teaching him the Torah Shabbal Peh. V'haya shoel es atzmo. Rabbi Akiva would ask himself, Lama shana Mishnah zu? Why was this Mishnah written in that way? V'lama shana Mishnah zu? And why was this Mishnah written in that way? Meaning the same question, the same tzurat chashiva, the way of approaching, the same curiosity that he had when he was just learning the Aleph Beis, he applied to the Mishnah, applied to his advanced studies. Right? This is the hitnotzetzut that Rav Kook is talking about, the hitnotzetzut of the yaldut, of the childhood, coming back la'et zikna, after, right, in old age, to apply to the more advanced studies. Where do we see that Rabbi Akiva has an incredible connection to the letters themselves? The letters themselves. There's a whole midrash that we've quoted a few times, right? Otiot de Rabbi Akiva. There's a midrash that was compiled just of the teachings of Rabbi Akiva about the letters themselves. The Gemara famously says in Maseches Menachos on Daf Chav Ches, it says that God instructed Moshe Rabbeinu to write the Torah with these crowns on top. So Moshe asks, right, these crowns, what are they doing here? Why do I need to write the letters with crowns? So God says, this is for a scholar that's going to live hundreds of years from now. The Akiva Shmo. That he would expound all these amazing insights from the smallest little spitz. We still can't think of a good translation for coats. We'll call it spitz for the time being. Right? Even from the spitz of the letters, he would be doresh. Rabbi Akiva, he went to the smallest features of the letters. He had this simple curiosity. Guys, we can't hear. He had this simple childlike curiosity that he applied to everything. He began to apply it to the letters, and then the more and more he advanced, he applied that same curiosity to everything. It's the hitnotzetzut, it's the blooming of the talalei yaldut, of the lights of childhood, le'ed zikna, through maturity. Right? It's the redemption. It's the redemption of the ideal going off the rails. It's perfect. It's almost like it sounds stereotypical in its simplicity, but it's not stereotypical because nothing could be further from the truth. It's literally founded in the pattern of Bereshit and the eventual redemption of the world. God created this world with vayinafash, to be the embodiment of the divine will, and things didn't go as planned. But every single day we say, Baruch Omer Ve'oseh, that blessing, that potentiality is still there, and it's coming into being. And similarly, when Rabbi Akiva started off his learning, he started with this simple curiosity, this simple yearning and trying to understand that, like, what is this saying? What's the significance of this? The more and more he progressed, the more and more he applied that energy, that childlike, idealistic energy to every step that he took. And that's the sod of the Otiot Matzpach, the seers, S-E-E-R-S, right? The people that can see far, right? They're all the way at the beginning, but they can see the ideal being played out way, way, way beyond, right? They're at the first letter, and then they can see the Otiot Sofiot, the final letter. They can see that, right? What does that mean to see? It means they carry the idealism through all the way to the end, despite all the corruption and despite all the perversion and despite all the disappointment and despite everything, they're able to carry that through. Rabbi Akiva, he embodied that. He learns the letters. He's like, what is this Aleph doing? What is this Beis doing? Right? Later on, he's like, what the Ketzos HaChoshen? It's the same curiosity that he has for those complex things, right? And it's a beautiful place to stop at the Otiot Manspach. Right? We finished the Otiot Manspach. Next year, we'll go into the Tagin, Bezrat Hashem, the crowns, right? The crowns that Rabbi Akiva was dorish, right? Even the small details of the crowns. Rabbi Akiva, in his simple childlike curiosity, he was able to get Tilei Tilim Shel Halachos. Bezrat Hashem. Sorry, a nimshal? What do you mean?
It seems to be giving a blueprint for how we will reach redemption. We'll undo all the things that may have gone wrong in creation. When we all go back to a childlike curiosity and discover.
The childlike curiosity is the ability to know what the ideal was in the beginning, and see that it's still applicable even now, despite the perversion and the fracture and all the catastrophe that went along. That's the sod of the Mansapach, the Geula oriented letters. Right? The childhood curiosity allows one to identify the ideal that was in the beginning and apply it in the end. Sure.